Evolution, Chapter 27. Hit hard. Magister Patellidae tapped another few keys on his console. He frowned. He hadn't heard from Jen or any of her team in days, not since they'd managed to track Agrigor to a remote set of islands just off the coast of Indonesia. He was getting worried. They were good kids, all of them, even Levin, who had a record that was, well, less than spotless. He was doing a quadrant-wide search for the two plumbers' badges and any sign of the Ultimatrix. It came up blank. He frowned and widened the search. It, too, came up blank. He rubbed his temple. Max would be back in less than 2 weeks. He dreaded the wrath of his old partner if he didn't have at least a whisper of his grandchildren by then. He sighed and widened his search again. The communicator on his badge rang. He answered it. "This is Magister Patellidae."
"Magister, this is Plumber Agent Wixom at base 7386.
Patellidae frowned. That was nearly 5 parsecs away. Why would he be getting this call? Wixom should be reporting to their own Magister. "How can I help you, Plumber?" he asked politely, but still confused. Wixom sighed.
"Well, we have 2 humans here. Claim to be Jen and Gwen Tennyson, but since you're their supervising Magister, we thought we'd call to confirm."
Patellidae sat up straight. "Plumber, is the brown one wearing the gosh darn Omnitrix or not? I know y'all know what that is, even out there." There were a few sounds over the line, and Patellidae held his breath.
"She is, sir. But they just kind of appeared here. We no idea how they got here. Their ship is in no way spaceworthy, sir. They don't have a teleporter?"
"Don't try to make sense of Tennyson's, Plumber. It'll get you nowhere. Wait. 2?
"Yes, Magister. 1 red, 1 brown and green. And a prisoner for transport to Encarcicon. They claim he's Osmosian, but scans claim he has no power at all."
Patellidae frowned. "Describe him, Plumber, or better yet, turn on your dang holo and let me talk to Jen."
"Yes, sir."
There were a few noises, and the holo communications came online. Patellidae caught sight of what must be Wixom, a tall, spindly creature with deep purple skin and large bulbous eyes. The being handed his badge off, and Jen resolved in front of him. She had seen better days. Her jacket was scorched in places. There was a fading bruise on her face. Her arm, not bearing the Omnitrix, was wrapped around her like she was in pain. There were dark bags under her eyes. "Kid, you look like you got chewed up and spat out by something from the depths. What happened?" She shook her head. "A lot. Do me a favor and put out a bolo on Kevin. I don't know what he might do, but he's a danger to himself and others right now." Her voice was low and hollow. Patellidae frowned. "Kid." She shook her head. "I don't have time to explain right now. I need you to do this for me. He won't look like Kevin. He's absorbed the Ultimatrix energy and mutated again. He also took Agrigor's power and the powers he took from the Andromeda aliens. But I think he still has his badge on him." She coughed, and Patellidae winced. A few specks of red painted her lips, but she seemed to shake off an agent who wasn't in range of the holoview. "I got it, kid. Let them give you and your cousin some medical attention." He tapped some keys. "I've got the fastest ship in the area headed your way to get you here. They'll be there in an hour. Get yourself stabilized and get on that transport. I'll have them send what's left of the Rust Bucket 3 later." Sounded like there wasn't much. Jen nodded, looking very pale. "Good, thank you." She handed the badge back to Wixom, who nodded. Patellidae was still frowning. "Is she actually getting looked over?" he asked the plumber, who looked back over his shoulder.
"She's insisting they look at the red one first, but both of them are being taken to medical."
Patellidae nodded. "Thank you, Plumber. Do me a favor and make sure they get on that transport."
"Absolutely, Magister. Thank you."
Patellidae nodded and hung up, breathing a sigh of relief as he typed out a bolo on Kevin. The poor kid. Osmosians got messed up in the head when they absorbed any energy, let alone as much as he had. He finished up the bolo and shook his head. He tapped the plumber at the next console on the shoulder. "I need a dip in the pool to work out this headache. Have me called for anything major. If it doesn't happen, call me when the Tennysons arrive." The agent nodded. "You got it, Magister." It took nearly 12 hours for the two Tennysons to arrive back at the Earth base. Gwen was physically fine, a few bumps and bruises and some minor burns. Jen had 3 broken ribs that had shifted nearly into her lung. She'd been confined to a stretcher, physically restrained to it, more accurately. She kept trying to get up and do things. Gwen was restraining her as the hover stretcher was guided down the hall into the medbay. "I'm fine." Gwen glared. "You have 3 broken ribs and the remains of a concussion." "Yeah, like I said, I'm fine." She glared at her cousin as the mana cuff moved to cover the Ultimatrix. "You're resting for the night or until your doctor says otherwise. I already lost 1 person today. I'm not losing you too." That shut Jen up, and she didn't complain as she was hovered into the med bay, but the 2 cousins stuck together like they were never going to let the other out of sight. Patelade frowned as one of the newer agents assigned to the base shook his head. "Those kids look like they've been through hell." Patelade nodded. "You have no idea how likely that is to be true. Possibly even literal." The agent blinked at him, but he didn't elaborate as he stepped past the doors and into the med bay. The resident Apollonite was shaking his head. "You're lucky they didn't shift during transport. 1 more round of healing and overnight observation before I even consider letting you out for duty." "I'm staying with her." Gwen stated it, more of a demand, really. But no one argued. Patelade nodded. "I'm inclined to agree. I do have to ask what happened. I doubt, given the nature of your mission, you can tell me everything, but maybe you can tell me why Agrigor is catatonic on his way to Inkarsakon." Jen glanced pointedly at the doctor. "I'll leave after I heal her. You can wait for a few minutes, Magister." The Pisceus Valon nodded. "Of course, Doc." They were all silent as the Apollonite got on with his work, shifting Jen's bones fully back into place and repairing the damage, all without ever cutting her skin. He finished quickly. "I'll send dinner down for both of you. There are showers right there. I'll see what we can scrounge up by way of clothes." Gwen searched her pockets and came up empty. "Someone should call our parents. Tell them we're okay. They can bring clothes by, but I think I left my phone in Ledger Domain." Jen shook her head. "Don't look at me. I lost mine in the Perplexahedron." Patelade stuck his head out the door and pulled aside one of the agents, giving her orders to contact the Tennysons and let them know that their daughters were all right. She rushed off to do just that. The doctor left, and Patelade turned to the girls. Their explanation was vague at best. Jen reached into her pocket and pulled out 3/4 of the map of infinity. Paradox took the piece from the Perplexahedron. "He's going to destroy it. No one will be able to access the information in the map without the whole, which means the other pieces will go back to being what they were." As if on cue, a bright light flashed and the map fell to pieces. A stone engraved with a pink rune, a piece of machinery, and what looked like a piece of ice in the shape of a perfect globe. Inside it rested tiny pieces of metal that swirled and spun like a model of a solar system. Or many. It changed too quickly to tell. She handed the metal device an ice globe to Patelade. "Make sure that gets back to Pisceus. This one needs to go back to the Necrophrygians." The third item, the stone with the pink engraving, seemed to have caught Gwen's attention. She stared at it, and Jen thought she spotted a flash of pink in her eyes. She retied the cord Adwecha had used to hold it on and slipped it on and under her shirt so it was out of view. "I'll keep hold of the Alpha rune until we can get it back to Ledger Domain." Gwen looked like she wanted to protest, but Jen shot her a look. "There's been enough temptation. We've lost enough to the thirst for power, Gwen." Gwen blinked, and it seemed the spell was broken. She nodded, looking down as someone knocked on the door. It was an agent bringing down food for the cousins. Luckily, it was Cooper, who was familiar with what the 2 would and wouldn't be able to eat. He'd also piled the trays high and had 2 Mr. Smoothies cups, which explained why it had taken so long. Patelade took the other 2 artifacts. I'll get these home, you have my word. They nodded at him. Jen spotted the Mr. Smoothies cups and smiled at Cooper. You are a blonde angel, Cooper. A small spot of brightness in an awful fucking day. Scratch that. One of the worst weeks of my entire life. Cooper handed her the cup. I got you the new flavor. Jen smiled at him and beckoned him over. He handed Gwen her tray and sat down Jen's. Jen pulled him into a hug. We need to talk. She hissed it in his ear so Gwen couldn't hear. Cooper raised an eyebrow but nodded slightly. Gwen dug into her food, oblivious to her cousin's words. Jen nodded back and tucked into her own plate as Cooper caught them up on what was happening on Earth during the 4 days they had been gone. It wasn't much. Neither girl told him what they'd been doing, nor why Kevin hadn't returned with them. Gwen soon ducked off to take a shower when one of the agents dropped off a few bags of clothes from their parents. Cooper turned to Jen. What's going on? I need your help building something, and Gwen can't know all of it. Cooper raised an eyebrow but leaned forward to hear her out. Chapter 28. Surprise Visit. Jen frowned. It had been a full 24 hours, and there was no sign of Kevin. Not a peep. Gwen was keeping quiet as the plumbers searched, but Patellidae insisted that the two of them take a few days off. They were never one to follow instructions. Besides, something odd was happening in the mana field. They were focusing on that for the moment. There wasn't much else they could do. Pierce was siding with Patellidae, and Cooper was beginning work on the project Jen had put to him, while Gwen was in the shower. Gwen had been informed of some of the powers behind the machine, but not all of it. Jen frowned as Gwen directed her to turn left outside of town and onto a dirt road heading out into the desert. You're sure? There's nothing out here. Gwen nodded, her eyes glowing. I'm sure. Besides, there is one thing out here. Jen frowned. Your old nest from when Big Chill had her babies? Both girls frowned. While the story was still slightly amusing, everything that had Kevin involved in it felt slightly tainted. Jen sighed. We don't even know what we're gonna find out here. How do we know Patellidae didn't beat us to it? Gwen shook her head. This is in the mana field. Unless he's got a magic user on staff, he won't be able to find it. Jen let out a bark of laughter. Gwen, you are the magic user on staff. Gwen nodded and sat forward. Stop here. Jen pulled off the road and frowned. She got out and looked around. There was nothing here. You're sure? Gwen nodded and led her off the road, Jen locking her car as they left. There's something down there, she pointed, eyes still glowing bright pink. There was a crater, not uncommon around Bellwood, but it appeared that this one had a small opening at the bottom, almost a tunnel. Jen nodded. Well, here goes nothing. The two of them were most of the way down the crater when the tunnel began to bubble with light. They had no time to scramble back out as pink light flooded the crater. Except it wasn't just light. It was bright pink water. Gwen grabbed Jen's hand and the two of them swam up to the surface. But when their heads broke it, they weren't in the desert outside Bellwood anymore. The sky was bright pink, and the ground around them twisted above their heads as they swam to shore. Where are we? Jen asked. Gwen looked around. Ledger domain. Jen blinked at her. You're sure? Gwen wrung the water out of her hair. Pretty sure. The crater must have been an old wellspring. When Jen just looked at her confused, Gwen shook her head. Magic on Earth is complicated. When the tech boom started, arguably in the Iron Age, it mostly died out, but the structure old-time magic users made is still there. They're called ley lines. Where a bunch of them meet is called a wellspring. In old legends, it's usually why so much magic stuff happens in certain places. There's a ton of them in England and Ireland and all over. But most of them are inaccessible. Someone who didn't know what it was inevitably builds something on top of it. Or they dry up when the magic left behind gets used by someone for a powerful spell. You didn't know there was a wellspring outside of Bellwood? Jen asked, incredulous. It wasn't there before. She glanced at the cord around Jen's neck, still sporting the alpha rune somewhere under her shirt. It must have been one of the dried out ones, but put the true name of magic next to that, and it floods, Jen said, pulling off her jacket and wringing it out as well. She sighed. Well, we did say we'd be back to help Charmcaster. Think you can find her? Gwen shrugged. I can certainly try. I've never tracked anyone in Ledger Domain. Gwen crossed her legs and focused. Just then, the alpha rune burned against Jen's skin. She cried out and yanked the pendant away from her skin. As she touched it, images flashed in her mind, and she blinked. It was like the alpha rune was showing her what she wanted to know. And luckily for them, the silver-haired enchantress wasn't far away. Gwen stared at her. What just happened? The alpha rune just told me where she is, and she needs help. Come on. Jen set off at a run, and Gwen swore, scrambling to her feet and following her cousin. When they arrived, they found Charmcaster duking it out with a collection of stone golems. She looked a bit wilder than she had last time they'd seen her. Her hair was a mess. Jen transformed on the fly, swamp fire diving directly into the fight. Gwen smacked 3 of them out of the way, and Charmcaster stared at them. Gwen threw a shield around them as one of the golems struck out at the distracted enchantress. Head in the game, please, Gwen stated, and Charmcaster nodded, twirling her uncle's old staff. Between the 3 of them, they made quick work of their opponents. When all that was left was unmoving rubble, Charmcaster turned to them, staring between the 2. You came back. How? Gwen explained how the wellspring had flooded and they'd surfaced here in Ledger Domain instead of in Bellwood. Charmcaster nodded as she stepped over to a large stone inscribed with runes. Didn't know there was a working wellspring near Bellwood. Jen shrugged. There wasn't. Not until recently. Charmcaster looked up at her, but Gwen was interested in the rock. Those are the runes for control. What is this? Charmcaster sighed. After you 3 left, I managed to defeat Adwaita, but breaking his control over the creatures and people here is a harder thing to do. She circled the rock again and frowned. He's got stones like this all over the realm. If I had the Alpha Rune, I could fix what he did to this place, but with it gone? Jen looked Charmcaster over as Gwen glanced at her cousin. If you had the Alpha Rune, if you got it back, what would you do with it? Would you try and fix the world or try to mold it to what you wanted it to be, no matter what other people here thought about it? Charmcaster blinked at her. I want my people free. I've spoken to some of the golems and other beings I've managed to free here. We all want the same thing. Freedom and stability in Ledger Domain. Jen nodded and pulled off the cord holding the stone. She tossed it to Charmcaster, who blinked down at the piece of immensely powerful magic she'd just been handed. You got it back. Jen nodded. We did. She didn't elaborate. And you're trusting me with it, after everything I've done. Why? Jen sighed as Gwen sent her a quizzical look. Because I need to believe that someone can be redeemed. That there is still some good in existence somewhere. Her voice was hollow as Gwen looked down at her shoes, more sad than Charmcaster had ever seen the 2 of them. The silver-haired sorceress fixed the cord around her neck and held up her hands, chanting as they began to glow. The rock in front of them cracked and the runes dissolved. At the same time, stones materialized, completing paths around them, and the few scant trees burst into bloom. Jen managed a slight smile. Charmcaster held out her hands to both cousins. I want to show you what you just saved, if you'll let me. Jen hesitated, but took her hand just as Gwen did. In a blink, they were standing on the balcony of what Jen recognized as the palace they'd fought Adwaita in front of. In front of the palace now was what looked like a burgeoning town, filled with people who looked a lot like Charmcaster. Different shades of silver hair and pink eyes. But there were creatures there that Jen didn't recognize, too. Charmcaster released their hands and floated up into the air. She pointed at one of the meager fields and chanted. It began to bloom and blossom. The people in the town paused, looking at what was happening before cheering as the new blooming spread to the few broken trees. Charmcaster landed and pulled Jen into a hug. Thank you. I've only ever read about times when Ledger Domain was peaceful and prosperous. Now I can make that true again. Gwen smiled slightly as Charmcaster looked around. Crap. Did I leave your boy behind? I didn't see him, she asked Gwen, and the air around them seemed to darken. Charmcaster looked them over. He wasn't with us. Jen said it with the finality of someone closing a topic of discussion permanently. Charmcaster nodded, conceding the point. I insist you stay for the feast. My honored guests for the night. They both of them remained quiet. Gwen, there's a library I know you'd love. Gwen perked up. Jen knew that she'd spend the night in there looking for a cure for Kevin. Couldn't hurt. In fact, it was quite beautiful. Jen really wished that Gwen hadn't slipped off to the library as soon as she physically could. It left her alone with Charmcaster, which made her slightly nervous, but spending time with the silver-haired girl, Jen realized that she really hadn't known anything about her. She was only a year older than the cousins, raised here in Ledger Domain until she was 6, when Adwaita had grown bothered by her father's rebellion. Spellbinder, the name her father had used, had gotten himself killed getting her and her uncle out of here. Her uncle was a less than perfect guardian. He'd been trying to gather power to take control of all magic on Earth in an attempt to reopen a portal to Ledger Domain and retake it from Adwaita. I feel sort of bad for squashing his plans all those times. Jen frowned as they sat together at the head of the table in the palace's long dining hall. Charmcaster shook her head. Don't. He went about it the wrong way. Enslaving one group of people to free another isn't right. Jen nodded. Glad we agree. Charmcaster smiled and toasted her with her silver goblet. Jen grinned and returned the toast. You know, you could stay the night. It sounds like you've got a lot going on back home and you need a break. Jen frowned. Charmcaster swirled the wine around her goblet. And it would give Gwen more time with the library. Maybe she'll find a solution to whatever problems got you acting so serious. Not that it's a bad look on you, but I honestly prefer your smile. Jen blinked at her. Are you flirting with me? Charmcaster looked at her from under hooded eyes. Is it working? Jen laughed loudly after a few minutes. Charmcaster joined her. Jen agreed after another glass of wine, which didn't seem to affect her like the apoplexy in whiskey did. The alcohol content wasn't nearly as high anyway. Gwen might find something in the library, and it was nice to look out over the people celebrating and consider that for the first time in nearly a month, she'd actually done something right. There was a knock on the door to her borrowed room. Charmcaster stood there and smiled at her. Pink's a good color on you. Jen rolled her eyes as she looked down at the nightgown that had been provided for her. It was the same shade of pink as the Enchantress's eyes and clashed horribly with the bright green Ultimatrix. Jen shrugged. Not my favorite color, but it's nice. Thank you. Charmcaster shook her head. I should be thanking you. Without the Alpha Rune, it would have taken me years to reconstruct Ledger Domain and fully break Adwaita's power. With it, it took me hours. I have something for you. Jen shook her head. Thanks, but I don't go for the whole hero's reward thing. Charmcaster frowned. You do so much for everyone around you, and you don't even want the reward? Jen beckoned her over to the window and pointed to where the party was still going on. A large, multicolored bonfire burned in the town square, and people danced around it as conjured illusions of dragons and other mythical marvels spun through the air. I do it for people like them, so they can have peace, even if I can't. Charmcaster nodded slightly as she watched her people celebrate their freedom. I do like that way of thinking, but you could have peace. You could stay here. Just because Adwaita's power is broken doesn't mean Ledger Domain doesn't need a hero. Jen shook her head. It doesn't. It already has one. Jen said, looking her straight in the face. She blushed slightly and gently elbowed the brunette. You're cheesy, but it's cute. She reached up and pulled something out from under the high collar of her shirt. It was a familiar silver ring and chain. Jen blinked as she unfastened it from around her neck and held it out to her. But the thing I wanted to give you is already yours to begin with. Jen hugged Charmcaster, seeming to take her completely by surprise. She looked up at her. The silver-haired girl, like most people Jen knew, was taller than her. Thank you. I thought I lost this forever. Charmcaster held it out, and Jen let her refasten the chain around her neck. Why'd you save it? Jen asked as she fiddled with the ring Ethan had given her what felt like years ago. Charmcaster shook her head as she looked back out the window. Don't know, really? Because I wanted you to keep your word. Come back, I guess. Made it feel like you had to. Jen looked Jen looked over at her. I would have anyway. I'm glad I got to come back so soon. Charmcaster grinned and turned to her, pecking her gently on the cheek. Me too. Get some sleep, hero. Jen blinked as the enchantress left the room.